Hello and good evening all. I hope you can hear me fine, and welcome to SAIS, and welcome Robbie. It's wonderful to have you here today in the Zoom room, even if not in our physical auditorium and classroom, beaming in from Baltimore. Tonight's session is part of the International Relations Seminar Series, which I host. I'm Nina Hall, for those who don't know, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Bologna. And I'm going to briefly introduce our guest, Robbie Shelliam, who will speak today on decolonizing politics. And he'll speak for about half an hour. And then I will offer you all sitting in the audience, hopefully, to ask some good questions. And please put that in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. So our guest, Robbie Shelliam, is a professor of international relations in the Department of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He researches the political and intellectual complicities of colonialism and race in the global order. And his latest book, Decolonizing Politics, was just published last year by Polity Press, and we'll hear more about that book today. And I have to admit, guiltily, I haven't yet got my hands on a copy of it because I ordered it and it's still arriving in the post. So hopefully, fingers crossed. And I think for all of you students in Bologna, there is one that should be arriving at the library soon too. So Robbie is actively engaged in influencing debates in IR around colonial, post-colonial, and decolonization. He set up a working group with that name at the British International Studies Association, and he's recently been elected the Vice President of the International Studies Association. And I first came across Robbie's work through this book, The Black Pacific, which is a fantastic book I would really recommend you read. And those of you in my IR Theories class will get a chance to read a section of it. And the book examines transnational solidarities between Maori rights activists, Black power activists, Rastafarian, from New Zealand to Africa. And it was written well before Black Lives Matter, a good decade before, but I think it captures a longer history of learning and cooperation between activists sitting thousands of miles away who share similar goals and frames of reference. The book also has quite an ambitious goal to study interactions of these anti-colonial solidarity movements without doing so without colonial science, trying to rethink even the science that we use to study these movements. So I think a natural next step beyond this book is the book we'll hear about today. I should also note, being from New Zealand, I really loved reading the book because it has shows a deep knowledge of Aotearoa New Zealand, and a great interview, which we talked about yesterday, Robbie, with an old family friend of ours, Bob Scott, and his role in supporting the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And it's not often you read a book and check the interview list and know exactly who that is. So that was a real delight. For those of you listening, just to finish off, I think there's real importance in what Robbie has to say today about decolonizing politics. And this has important implications wherever you go on to work, if it's in the US State Department, NGOs, consultancy, hedge fund, think tank, or any university, because many of our major institutions are grappling with the implications of colonialism, racism, and oppression. Universities, including our own, Johns Hopkins University, are trying to think through their own histories, their relationship to slavery, imperialism. In the UK, many universities are coping with the Rhodes Must Fall movement, particularly in Oxford, but also in South Africa and Cape Town. And I think understanding what we'll hear today will have many other applications for you in your future work and your future engagement in politics and society. So thanks very much. I'll hand over to you, Robbie, and take it away.
Thank you, Nina, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Alessandra, and everybody who's made this this talk possible. It's good to see, well, I can't see you, but it's good to be with everybody who's here. So I'm going to talk to you about this, that book that that's just coming out now, Decolonizing Politics. And it's about, the book's about how we can expose the colonial logics of political science, the academic study of politics, and how we can rethink politics with different logics. Right, logics that don't depend upon categories that separate and segregate humanity into hierarchies of proper citizens, not proper citizens, degenerate populations. I wrote it for undergrads to help them to think critically and more precisely about current day controversies over decolonizing the academy. And I want to get at the theme of the book by talking about two theorists. Okay, so I'm going to mostly talk to you about two theorists, and I'm going to put them into conversation. So let me start by telling you about the first one. He's a non-European political theorist. He was born into a settler colony which had increasingly become part of a broader imperial complex. His mother came from the colonizers who had settled the city of his birth. His father served as a physician to the elites of a competing imperial power to the north. The theorist I'm talking about probably spent some of his early childhood with his father in the court of this competing power. Still, most of his life would be spent as an immigrant, as what we would call in the US context a permanent alien. As a young adult, he moved to a famous school in a famous multicultural city, eventually founded his own school there. But despite always being associated with this multicultural city, he never felt at home there. He once confided to a friend that the same things are not proper for a foreigner as they are for a citizen. In fact, on a number of occasions, he was on the receiving end of xenophobia, and he was even cast as an enemy of the people due to his father's connections to this imperial power to the north that now threatened the sovereignty of the city he lived in. At one point, as these political contestations ratcheted up, he was forced to flee as a political exile. He couldn't return to the place of his birth because that had just been destroyed in the course of this now military conflict. He moved instead to foreign shores. He married there, raised a family. While the northern imperial power, now hegemonic, its leaders invited him to follow his father's footsteps, to live in its courts and to be tutor to the elite children. And he did so, teaching the subjects of monarchies and colonies. After some time, the theorist returned to the metropolitan city where he had previously ran his school. There he wrote a treatise on politics that managed to survive 200 years of neglect so as to now sit in our libraries. Well, more political intrigues, imperial twists and turns saw him having to flee once more under duress. This time, for the last time, he returned to the city of his mother's birth, to her colonial estates, and he died there. An immigrant, a permanent alien, a political exile, refugee, possibly twice over. Even if his mother had estates and his father worked in court, that angle on the world made him theorize not only the citizen in the state, but also the slave, the foreigner, the immigrant. All this to figure out who could pursue the good life and how it might be preserved from the degenerative effects of imperial expansion and war. So this guy was called Aristotle. I guess you know him. Well, Aristotle was no revolutionary. He was conservative in the literal sense. Aristotle wished to conserve the possibility of living in a just polis, but one that was for him modeled on the small settler colony of his birth, his mother's city of Stagiaira. All this had a bearing on the formulation of Aristotle's most famous statement in that treatise he wrote in Athens: a human is by nature a political animal. Aristotle's conception of nature is counterintuitive. What happens usually, and for the most part, neither accidental nor essential, stable enough to be studied, variable enough that any study will be imperfect. Unlike animals, says Aristotle, human beings are endowed with a capacity to reason that's especially congruent to the imperfect regularity of nature. To live sociably, humans make choices to evaluate all the possibilities of a course of action. This collective deliberation can help determine how best to attain the good life, not in an accidental or essential fashion, but for a specific time or place. That deliberation involves judgment, and that's the nature of politics. Well, what is this nature of politics in Aristotle's time and place? He accepts that deliberation requires leisure time, and therein lies the rub. Those who plant the fields, those who raise children, do not have spare time. So politics can only work through a hierarchical division of labor, which enfranchises some as active citizens over and above other people in those citizens' households, such as women and slaves. That's the hierarchy that Aristotle wishes to conserve, the only one that might, in his estimation, make the good life attainable. Yet recall his understanding of human nature. There's a subtle and important distinction between, on the one hand, arguing that hierarchy is usual, and on the other hand, claiming that certain peoples by necessity and essence occupy certain places in that hierarchy. Aristotle proposes the former, not the latter. And remember the paths that he's traveled in his life by the time he writes the treatise on politics. He's moved from a citizen of Stagiaira, a colony city, to become a resident alien, a metic of Athens, to be viewed as a sympathizer of Macedonia, because remember I said his father served as a physician to the elites of a competing imperial power to the north. Well, that power was Macedonia. And it wasn't only the imperial power of Persia that threatened the Delian League of Greek city-states led by Athens. By the time that Aristotle was born, Macedonia did too. And under Philip II, its armies expanded into Greek territories. Ultimately, Philip would conquer Athens and form a new federation of city-states, the League of Corinth, under Macedonian hegemony. So, leaving Athens as a purported sympathizer of non-Greek barbarian empires, Aristotle sought asylum in present-day Turkey. After that, he tutored Philip's son, Alexander the Great, in the imperial Macedonian court, then returned to his life as a resident alien in Athens again before one last political exile to Chalcis. All his life, this father of political science, as we know it, has moved into and through different hierarchies. Given this lived experience and his understanding of the nature of the political animal, it's reasonable to suppose that Aristotle is trying to sensitize Athenian citizens to the fact that their place at the apex of the political hierarchy can shift. Empires, says Aristotle, by and large produce despots. And if Athens loses its sovereignty to these empires, even Athenian citizens might have to sacrifice their human faculty of deliberation to slavishly serve those despots. Might natural slavery be the fate even of the citizens of empire? Here's Derek Walcott, famous St. Lucian poet from the Caribbean, Nobel Prize winner, comparing the Aegean and Caribbean seas and finding much in common. If we looked at them now, we would say that the ancient Greeks had Puerto Rican taste, right? Because the stones were painted brightly. They weren't these bleached stones. Time went by and they sort of whitened and weathered. The classics began to be thought of as something bleached out and rain-spotted, distant. So let's remember this. The tradition of political science that the Western Academy says begins with Aristotle begins in a non-European world of empires, colonizers, migrants, refugees, and slaves. Aristotle and the Greeks in general did not consider themselves Europeans. Europeans were the barbarians to the north. So the normal citizen of the normal polis doesn't exist somehow outside of this context, but is entangled within it, within a violent imperial world. That's the context within which Aristotle theorizes the pursuit of the good life. But to return to his conservatism, even if Aristotle thinks that people's positions in the hierarchy can change, the hierarchy itself is non-negotiable for him. Citizens require slaves, wives, other kinds of workers. They require it because they need themselves leisure time to collectively deliberate. So even if Aristotle is somewhat on the margins in Athens, a permanent alien, he's nonetheless convinced that citizenship on these terms is the best hope for the good life. Look, he's not talking to the slaves, the wives, the immigrants about the dangers of empire. He's talking to the citizens about preserving the hierarchy that puts them at the top. He's talking to the center of the polis. He's talking to the center about how to preserve the center. What about talking from those places that have been made peripherals to that center? What about talking there to other peripheralized peoples, about those who have done the peripheralizing? Well, we're now going to put Aristotle in conversation with Gloria Anzaldúa, a Chicana queer theorist. She passed in 2004. Chicanx describes those people living in the US who are of Mexican descent. Queer theory seeks to unsettle the binaries that are ascribed to people's personal and political identities, and to raise the possibility that there are multiple, perhaps endless, articulations of masculinity, femininity, and other expressions of being together. Well, Anzaldúa confronts the phenomenon that in politics represents perhaps the most consequential division of all, the border. She tells the history of a specific border, that which divides the US and Mexico, except the way in which she narrates this history is not from the centralized perspective of the state or the polis and its citizen. It's the story of the borderlands. Anzaldúa's story begins with the ancient ancestors of the Chicanx peoples who occupied or regularly migrated through the southwest of the US. In 1000 BC, these ancestors undertook one of a number of large migrations further to the south. In the 16th century, the Spanish conquistadors conquered these ancestors' lands of settlement in what was named New Spain and is present-day Mexico. Germs arrived with the Spanish, for which the indigenous people had little immunity. The population collapsed. Mestizos, usually the progeny of Spanish fathers and indigenous mothers, had both Spanish immunity and indigenous heritage. They increasingly populated these colonized lands. Some of those mestizo migrated back north to the lands they came from, their ancestors came from, alongside Spanish people in search of gold. They became the people now called Chicanx. Part of these lands were called Texas, which then became part of the state of Mexico after its independence from Spain in 1821. White settlers from the US migrated illegally into Texas and challenged Mexico's sovereignty there. In 1846, the US took Texas from Mexico through a war fought in good part of preserving slavery's westward expansion. Much of the land lived on by Mexicans was subsequently stolen by white settlers. A race war in 1915 led to further violent dispossession. Many Chicanx became sharecroppers, people who farmed on another person's land. Anzaldúa's point is that the indigeneity of Chicanx people is neither fixed nor essential, but constituted through mixing and movement. We have a tradition, she notes, of long walks. The colonial response to this tradition of migration has been one of violent and racist dispossession of lands by settler colonial forces. Home for Chicanx then is, as she calls it, a thin edge of barbed wire. Conventionally, the border is the limit of governmental authority, marking citizens off from non-citizens, legal residents off from non-legal residents. The border is the frontier of the good life. Aristotle shares something with Anzaldúa's story of Chicanx people. His experience as a non-citizen in Athens, even as an asylum seeker in present-day Turkey, enables him to proffer a critique of imperialism. Nonetheless, his critique is designed to preserve citizenship on exclusionary terms. Anzaldúa is not interested in holding the center together, even from the margins. She wants to get rid of the very project of building and defending centers, a project that seems to have marginalization as its quintessential logic. So Anzaldúa conceives of the border less as a limit and more as a place that cultivates a particular kind of living. At the border, the lifeblood of two worlds merges to form a border culture. This culture is the product of those who are not supposed to be able to create anything of value, the supposedly abnormal, non-citizen, illegal, maladjusted, uncivilized, that are so important to our logics of political science. And Zanvyl describes them as the perverse, the queer, the troublesome, the mongrel, the mulatto, the half-breed. And the culture they create, she notes, is far from fixed, but rather in a constant state of transition. For Zanvyl, then, the border is both a place, a condition of being, and a psychic space. It's also a place, space, psyche that is brought into being by oppression and violence, especially when it comes to indigenous women. And that's a really important factor for Zanvyl, because for her, there is no culture, colonial, pre-colonial, or otherwise, that can claim innocence from oppression and violence. Zanvyl reflects on her own childhood. She talks of the way in which culture is made by those in power, the men. Women are only supposed to transmit culture, not create it. That's consonant with the Catholic Church's insistence of the subordination of women to men. Organized religion codes women as carnal, animal, closer to the undivine. Woman must be protected above all from the shadow beast in herself. Man is coded as closer to the divine and a protector of woman. Deviance is a crime against God and man. With these cultural strictures, there exist 4 options for women, says Zanvyl. Remain a virgin until marriage, thereby becoming a good mother. Take to the streets as a prostitute and be damned. Escape to the church to become a nun, or use education to forge a career and become autonomous. That last choice might seem the most attractive, but in practice, it's a choice available only for a tiny minority. Zanvyl then provides 3 responses to these unattractive choices. Firstly, Chicana women can conform to the values of culture, even if they are oppressive, in order to avoid rejection. This, though, pushes the oppressive nature of culture into the shadows, waiting to return. Or second, Chicana women might stare directly at the shadow beast, at the sexual lust and the lust for power and destruction that underpins the male heterosexual order. But Zanvyl describes how she herself has followed a 3rd response. As a child, she's rebellious. She hates constraints, even ones that are self-imposed. She talks of and embraces the fact that she has the shadow beast in her. Choosing to be queer, a so-called deviant, Zanvyl realizes that the beast is not what it is said to be. The duality that limits human nature to either male or female, divine or beast, is fundamentally challenged by queer people. Zanvyl talks of herself as 2 in 1 body, the coming together of opposite qualities within. For her, the ultimate rebellion that she can make against her native culture is through her sexual behavior, but counterintuitively, and listen to this bit, she understands that rebellion to be a reclamation, a reclaiming of that culture, of its non-dualistic, mixed, and migratory histories. Well, counterintuition requires counter stories. Zanvyl argues that her Chicanic identity is grounded in the Indian woman's history of resistance. She narrates a complex history, a history of Quetzalcoatl, a name given to the creator goddess of Mesoamerican fertility rites and the mother of celestial deities. As a creator, she has both dark and light aspects that work in relation to each other, and her creative power is also necessarily sexual and coiled. Interestingly, Quetzalcoatl can be glossed as the one who has dominion over serpents. Zanvyl recalls how this goddess was displaced by a male-dominated Azteca Mexica culture. In this displacement, the goddess became less of a being, her fullness attenuated, cut in half. And then the Catholic Church forbade all indigenous spiritual agents on account of them being associated with the devil. But the church associated Quetzalcoatl with the Virgin of Guadalupe, the form that the Virgin Mary took in Mexico when it appeared to peasants in the 16th century. And in this way, the creator goddess was split from her dark and sexual energies and de-indigenized to become the good mother. Still, Zanvyl notes that the Virgin of Guadalupe retains some of Quatlisup's subversive aspects. To poor people, Guadalupe represents the pain of conquest and oppression, but also the hope and faith that comes with survival. The Virgin of Guadalupe also speaks to multiple races, religions, languages, and she mediates between Spanish, Indian, and African cultures. Through the intercession of Guadalupe, Zanvyl realizes that the shadow beast is what remains of Quatlisup after she has been diminished and demonized by both Aztec patriarchy and the Catholic Church. Embracing the fullness of the beast, Zanvyl seeks to renew the powers of Quatlisup, powers that do not reproduce dualisms of male and female, virtue and sexuality, reason and feeling, light and dark. This is why, choosing to be, in her words, a lesbian of color, Zanvyl consistently proclaims throughout her book, "Not me sold out my people, but they me. Not me sold out my people, but they me." Aristotle was a critic of imperialism insofar as he feared the diminution of the good life that it would bring, even upon those who practiced it. Still, this good life for Aristotle was predicated upon the hierarchies of the patriarchal household, including slavery. These are the hierarchies that Zanvyl wishes to leave behind as much as imperialism. Reviving the Chicanx culture, Zanvyl promotes a new mestiza consciousness. She calls it a consciousness of the borderlands. Cultivated through the experience of oppression and violence, this consciousness does not seek out revenge, but rather wishes to uproot dualistic thinking in order to bring an end to rape, violence, and war. It's born of a feminist struggle that requires new masculinities. Mestiza consciousness seeks to rupture oppressive traditions, re-narrate histories, and reinterpret symbols. It wants to strengthen tolerance and ambiguity. It blends all blood so as to help bring into being a broader communal ground for all those who have experienced violent oppression. It even hopes, she says, that whites will stop trying to help us and realize that they need to follow our lead. Might those of us who wish to decolonize political science also follow that lead? Well, in introducing these two thinkers, I've also introduced you to some of the key maneuvers needed to decolonize the study of politics, the field of political science. And I should say that I do not think that absolutely all politics in the world have a colonial heritage or logic, or if they do, that heritage or logic is fundamental to explaining those politics. It's a big world. The human condition is never ending in its complexity. But I do maintain that political science is formed as a discipline from imperial heritages and with abiding colonial logics. So I'm talking about decolonizing the academic study of politics, not politics per se. But that said, I'm hoping that you might have sensed that in order to pursue such a decolonization of knowledge requires us to commit to broader programs of global justice outside of the academy narrowly conceived. Anyway, here are three maneuvers that I think are crucial to decolonizing political science. Firstly, recontextualization. We have to recontextualize political thinkers within the imperial and colonial context that form the backdrop to their ruminations. For instance, Aristotle is writing from within an imperial epoch where not one but two imperial powers are encroaching upon Athens. What's more, settler colonialism, or the expansion of what the ancient Greeks called the apoikia, settler colonialism has created the very polities that make for his ideal polis. Many textbooks present Aristotle as the philosopher of the good life, the examiner of the citizen in the polis, but that vision would only reveal to you half of the story. Aristotle examines the polis in relation to empire and the ways in which the position of the citizen itself is threatened by imperialism. Well, we're now starting to talk about the second maneuver, The act of recontextualizing thinkers by reference to imperialism and colonialism must make a difference to how we understand the logics of these thinkers' arguments. Recontextualization leads to reconceptualization. For example, instead of just presenting the citizen in and of himself, we have to understand citizenship by figuring out, as Aristotle actually did, the relationship of the citizen to the metic, the permanent alien, the wife, the slave, the barbarian. The citizen can no longer be considered a stand-alone category. This means that reconceptualization is also an issue of epistemology. What counts as valid knowledge? Reconceptualizing involves tracking the connecting tissues that arrange concepts and categories in logical fashion. For instance, Aristotle's hierarchies are not comprised of fixed objects in fixed positions. Instead, hierarchies are comprised of positions that can be occupied differently by different objects. The stakes at play in this reconceptualization must always be clarified by reference to empire and colonialism. For instance, Aristotle is trying to warn Athenian citizens that imperialism might force upon them the position of slaves. So decolonizing politics can't just be about retrieving histories of imperialism and colonialism. It must also be about finding concealed or ignored logics in popular and conventional arguments. It must be about uncovering the deep colonial logics that animate concepts and categories in political science. But that moves us to the third and the most difficult maneuver, reimagining. Let me introduce this to you by talking about canons. The idea of a canon is at root a religious one, referring to a selection of scriptures considered to be true and sacred. And when applied to academia, a canon refers to the set of authors and texts that are supposed to faithfully induct the student into the discipline. All disciplines have canons, and political science is no exception. The so-called father of political science, Aristotle, often sits at the head of the canon. But canons necessarily limit our understandings and imaginations. A critical evaluation of works within the canon is necessary but not sufficient for the decolonizing mission. We must also try to glean the margins of power. We must imagine, at least in principle, that those who dwell in these marginalized positions have traditions of thought that are generally edifying. Let me ask you this: why would we not imagine this to be the case, at least in principle? Zanvyl's notion of a borderland consciousness is developed in the borderlands to address people living on the borderlands, but to think about the world at large. It's not a provincial consciousness, or let me put it this way: a center consciousness might be far more provincial in outlook than a borderland consciousness. That said, it's not always easy to find an author, a collective, or a movement that directly corresponds with or speaks back to the canon. And I'm sure intellectual historians would be aghast at me putting a 4th century BC Greek in conversation with a 20th century Chicana. Still, the reason for the lack of direct correspondence is simple but disturbing. Imperial centers talk to colonial margins but rarely listen back to them. That's broadly the case in academia as well as politics proper. And because centers rarely listen back, you will not usually find colonial voices articulating themselves in the repositories and archives of politics. That is the mainstream recorded history of politics. So you have to creatively seek out resonances, perhaps in unlikely places. Bring together the responses that you can find. Is that a flight of fancy? Perhaps. But remember, Aristotle thought that Europeans were barbarians, their arrangements ill-suited to collectively deliberate on the good life. He might have considered the claim that you can read forward a European tradition of political thought from ancient Greece, similarly a flight of fancy. So with this third maneuver of reimagining, we do not merely illustrate the ways in which some of the key arguments in political science have evolved with colonial logics and meanings. We also move those arguments into marginal locations or locations that have been marginalized intellectually, conceptually, and politically. We could even imagine that these marginal locations connect to each other despite the wishes of the imperial center. I demonstrated that Aristotle was profoundly conservative. There are more conservatisms than the big C ideology, and conservatism per se is not necessarily a bad thing. We all wish to conserve that which we think is good. The question is whether what we think is good requires the suppression of the good life for others. Well, Aristotle wished to conserve the practice of citizenship, but that practice depended upon hierarchies of dependency, wherein the labor of slaves and women allowed free time for the man to exercise his deliberative reason in the absence of immigrants in the agora, the public space of citizens and the debating arena of politics. In fact, one could say that Aristotle's political writings were in part responding to an anti-slavery movement that had been defeated earlier in his century, but the message of which lingered on. If slavery was against natural law, then the privileged status of citizenship enjoyed by some but not others was morally untenable. But it wouldn't occur for Aristotle to talk to slaves about preserving citizenship, or to talk to wives or even non-citizens about citizenship, even if he was a non-citizen himself, at least in Athens. But did no migrant ever talk to another migrant in salient terms about the border? Did no wife ever talk to another wife in salient terms about the weight of patriarchy? Did no slave ever talk to another slave in salient terms about freedom and a good life? Might not non-citizens of various types conceptualize citizenship differently, together, saliently? Well, thinking in such an audacious manner, and Zaldua's manner, allows us to place scholarly debates within broader constellations of logic and meaning. We gain a fuller understanding of the same issues. The master presumed he never had to know what the slave was thinking. After all, everyone told him that slaves couldn't think properly. But in order to survive creatively, the slave had to know what she thought and how the master thought. Who would you turn to for an explanation of slavery, him or her? Put another way, studying only the center does not reveal to you the margins, but studying from the margins can inform you of the margins, the center, and their relationality. That is the larger constellation of political activity. Here's the thing, we can reconceptualize and recontextualize the intellectual roots of political science. We can do that deconstruction, but without doing the work of reimagining, it's all too easy to recenter the center, even with the best of intentions. Most of the time, problems only become real problems when they hit the center, even if they have dwelt on and grown in and circulated around the borderlands for generations. Sensational news items, shootouts, dirty deals, riots, wars, usually represent the visible tip of political phenomena that grow behind doors, in backyards, down dirt tracks. I'm talking, for example, about the murder of intimate partners, the slow death suffered by poor people living in toxic environments, the experimentation in techniques of violence upon those who have no course to legal redress. Well, I mentioned that decolonizing politics necessarily implicates an engagement with wider issues of global justice. So here's how I end up suggesting that undergrads might make that engagement. So here's something to think about. Pick a political issue that feels most intimate to you for whatever reason. Gather with others who feel the same way. Consider the colonial and hierarchical logics that underpin the political analysis of that issue. Then think about how a borderland consciousness might critique that analysis. Imagine what other divisions and separations such a critique would bring to the fore, and who or what might be the agents of repair. Spend some time and effort searching for these agents, past or present. They might even have a presence within you or amongst your convened group. think about what you could offer them or their contemporary descendants and equivalents whilst they teach you. Take the bumps and scrapes that you might receive along the way in good faith. Imagine what practical and ethical structures would need to be put in place to make this relationship sustainable, equitable, honest, and careful during and after your time in the academy, and then pursue that solidarity however you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie. That was fantastic. And if we were here, I would encourage everyone, and if we were together, I would encourage everyone to give you a round of applause, but I will do it myself. You really laid out a great challenge for us for tonight's conversation. And I certainly have my fair share of questions that came up, but I wonder, does anyone in the participants, any of the participants want to ask anything? We have a mix of, I can see some of our students. All right, I'm gonna start out then. When you engaged in writing this book, and you mentioned that right in your three sort of challenges to how we should decolonize politics, how did you go about choosing the scholars you wanted to pair? I imagine that these are not the only two, but how did you yourself write this book? How did you decide and end up with that pair, for instance?
Yeah. Idiosyncratically, basically. So I basically thought about what, so the book's divided into subfields, right? Political theory, political behavior, comparative politics, and international relations. And what I did was think about, what was one of the big main kind of themes in each of them subfields. So political theory would be something about universal rights. Political behavior would be something about citizenship. Comparative politics would be something about development, and international relations would be something about the determinants of the war and peace, right? And so I picked authors which were quite foundational institutionally for those subfields, right? And then I looked to authors and movements as well, which provided very different logics to explaining those basic themes. So in political theory, I worked with Immanuel Kant, and I counterposed Sylvia Wynter, the famous Caribbean theorist, the cultural theorist, to Kant. Kant's theory of universal rights is predicated upon a racialized anthropology of the human, and Wynter directly challenges that, even if she never talked about Kant, right? So I kind of do that in each one, and for your info, in IR, I take this guy who was the one of the main progenitors of what they call the English school of IR, Martin White, who's people, if you hear international society, that's Martin White's phase. And I contrasted that Martin White's analysis of international society to the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement. Yeah, so it's, I guess one of the things to say is that, the people that I chose when I'm talking about the actual subfields are people who are quite central to them subfields. But I was imaginative in terms of who I thought would be able to talk about the same issues, but quite radically differently. And it's important to think about this, about the same issues. It's not that Europe created rights. Rights in various languages and various conceptions have been around for quite a long time, and there have been very many different discussions on that. Ideas about belonging, political belonging, and citizenship have been around for a long, long time. Ideas about development even have been around for quite a long, long time, and certainly war and peace. So these are not issues which we need to shy away from, because they're foundational to the to the field of political science. The great mistake would be to imagine that European thinkers created all these themes and concepts, and that would just be unfair to them and put them under far too much pressure.
We wouldn't want that, far too much pressure. Questions from the audience? Still waiting, still negotiating and thinking it through. Well, what responses have you had from your students and others to these challenges? Have people come up with other alternatives from you, or what have been the responses you've had?
Oof. That's a good question. Not really so far with this particular book, because it only got published about a month ago now. So I'm teaching it in a couple of classes at the moment, you know, but not the book itself, but the kind of material which went into it. I think that people are by and large, I mean, if I was to think about the field as a whole, I would say that it's not unusual or unheard of for people to do recontextualizing, right? That's quite a, you know, an old tradition, you know, put people in their context. That tradition has been less thoughtful about thinking about the imperial roots and context. I give you one very quick example. You know, Immanuel Kant lived most of his life in Königsberg, a seaport in, you know, what is now Russia, but was East Prussia at the time. You know, a lot of intellectual history about Kant is around Kant and, you know, the travails over forming a German polity and French Revolution and all that kind of stuff, right? But Königsberg was a major seaport. His best friend was an English trader, and through that port came all kinds of material cultures and ideas about this imperial world that the rest of Europe was populating. And when you look at Kant's works, especially his anthropology works, but not just those, you find a constant referencing to travelogues. Captain Cook's in there, right? You know, the travelogues of Europeans going to strange and wonderful places with strange and wonderful and terrible creatures inhabiting them is part of his archive for thinking through the question of human difference and universal reason, right? So that's, you know, contextualizing in history is not unusual. Much more work needs to be doing on thinking about that beyond simply a European, or I would say even a national American kind of framework. And then the reimagining is difficult because there are stakes at play. There are stakes at play. You know, and I get it. I don't mean this I don't mean to moralize, right? You know, how many political science or political theorists have, you know, got their training from undergrad to their PhD by, you know, learning something about Aristotle? Plenty, right? So, you know, there's an investment in Aristotle. Now, they might say, well, no, but that's cool. I can run with what you're saying about Aristotle and empire, you know, because Mary Dietz has published that in, you know, American Political Science Review, one of the big journals of the field. So, you know, I can still work with it. But now if I said to them, okay, replace or put Aristotle in conversation with Gloria Anzaldúa, they'd be like, who? Yeah, she's a cultural theorist. Oh, yeah, but we did political science. She's talking about borders. Tell me why borders isn't important to political science. Yeah, but, you know, right? But it's partly because they weren't trained like that.
Yeah.
So you know, even beyond the kind of ideology about Eurocentrism and white supremacy, it's a question about training as well, right? And so I'm just being generous in the sense that, you know, it's easy to you could do a course on Aristotle and empire, you could refit it, but then to talk about borderland consciousness with Anzaldúa requires a whole set of new commitments, and that's why I think that it's the early career people who are taking this up, not the old guard.
And I want to sort of investigate this thought a little bit more around how you reimagine, because in our class on IR theories, I do a class on is IR too Western centric, And one of the pieces we read is Pinar Bilgin's piece, looking at sort of mimetic practices. And she makes this argument that in a way, the kind of efforts to save international relations by looking at the other and expecting the other to be different is dangerous because, you know, in her case, you know, Turkey or other cases she looks at, we see similar practices, but they have different underlying reasons for it. So I guess, I mean, you're familiar with that piece, but even if you weren't, like, the question is, how then do we as scholars, if we are trained in particular ways, see things differently? Because we might pick out and see a similarity because we're trained in that way, but there may be underlying differences in why it's happening in that way. It's a little bit vague for those of you who haven't read but
No, I get you, and it's, as I said, and it requires delicacy, right? You know, a lot of people that I used to know and work with in you know, around South Pacific indigenous peoples, you know, to the, you know, there's a certain place that indigenous peoples have in the academy. I'm talking idealistically, whereby you go to indigenous peoples for peace and for holism and for environmentalism and all this kind of stuff, right? But you know, a lot of indigenous people want to figure out why they were going to war with each other because that's far more salient. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, as if people never went to war with each other, right? The question then becomes, what intellectual and ethical and practical resources do you have by which to address the problem of war? That's the question.
Yeah.
If you have a logic coming out of a lot of the IR scholars or a lot of the European, European politics people, talking historically, then that logic is it's the lesser, not properly humans. It's the ones who haven't actually developed civilization, right? Those are the ones who are dangerous and anarchical, right? So the task of the European is to treat each other as equals, but then to paternalistically keep order amongst the others. And that's how you assure peace, right? And don't tell me the EU isn't all based on that, right? Because it kind of is, right? But that logic, that colonial logic, right, is the logic which keeps reintroducing war. Because what happens when people don't want to have an order on your terms? What if they don't want to be under your paternalism? What if that paternalism to them is actually imperialism and fostering dependency instead of self-determination? Well, how does that get read back by these Europeans with a big E? Yeah, Immanuel Kant, actually, right? How does it get read back? Or John Stuart Mill. It gets read back as these guys are irrational. These guys are non-civilized, and they're not quite yet up to the task of understanding that order is the fundamental premise for political life and for the good life to flower. Our order. So what happens? War. So what I'm saying is that we need to think about, this is not an identity thing. This is not a race thing, genetic thing. This is about what resources, intellectual, ethical, and practical, does humanity have to mitigate against war? Where can they be found, and why is it that the places where they can best be found seem to be the places where you should actually go to war against?
This conversation is bringing me back to my undergraduate at the University of Auckland, and I did do a class on Western political thought, which I think did start with Aristotle, as it happens. I'm pleased to tell you, after taking a class in Western political thought, the same professor, and I think it was Hurrell, Professor Hurrell. No, I'm getting that confused. It wasn't. He taught a class, though, on the politics of control, concepts of control, which include Maori concepts of control, and as well as alongside Western ones. And it was one of the most interesting classes I took because, like you say, it started with the concept. What do we think of when we think of power? What does that mean? How do we break down power, both from Western theorists and from Maori? And it really, it really challenged the way I thought and the way I put knowledge together. And I guess the question is, in your book, is how can we envision more classes where we're able to do that, both as students, for those of you who are attending as students, and for those of us who are teachers. And I have a question. I have two. Excellent. Davide Tabarelli has asked, what about slavery and the role of machines to free humankind from it? Has slavery disappeared, or can we consider the labor conditions in some countries like slavery? Do you want to answer one at a time, or I'll give you one at a time?
Let me quickly, well, I wouldn't be able to answer that, but let me just give you some thoughts about that, right? And again, this links to colonial logics behind certain concepts and categories. So I might have a lot of I might have a lot of beef with Aristotle in some ways, right? But Aristotle's conception of the natural slave was not what people think it was. Aristotle's conception, remember, it said nature for Aristotle is what happens usually and for the most part. So the natural slave for Aristotle was nothing about essence. It wasn't even about ethnicity, actually, right? It was about, usually and for the most part, citizenship requires slavery from others. And slavery is defined by those who cannot collectively deliberate over premeditated ends. Very practically, they can't, because they're doing the work. And the citizen who's sitting in the agora has practically the time and reason to do that. So for Aristotle, it's a very practical thing. You know, basically the citizen requires the slave, right? Now, fast forward to the 1400s, 1500s, and then this natural slave has been reintroduced, but as a biological essence pertaining to the sin of Ham in Genesis in the Bible. And it pertains to Africans and natural slaves by virtue of their biology and the fact, and biology meaning also their heredity in terms of the Old Testament, right? So now it's not usually, for the most part, it's essence, right? It's not what you can do, your practical competencies, it's your biological essences, right? Now, I'm saying that because, you know, we could think very differently about slavery in either one of those. Compound on top of that, this assumption that abolition led to freedom in the 19th century. Abolition did not lead to freedom. In fact, the first abolition emancipation text, the 1807 abolition of the slave trade, and then the 1833 Slavery Emancipation Act. Both of them said that in different ways, but let me just do the 1833 one. The 1833 one said that slaves become apprentices to the same masters. And in fact, abolition from the 1780s onwards, white abolitionism as an ideology from the 1780s onwards, what it sought to do was replace slavery with servitude. That's literally what they wanted for various reasons. If we actually go with that and start thinking a bit more deeply about that, right, then the idea that abolition led to a world of free labor is nonsense, and it never did. So thinking about these concepts more carefully in terms of the colonial logics of them, rather than just as abstract categories, right, can help us to think about the more practical questions today about, you know, is slavery an affront because it's an international law that no one can be a slave. Whereas the actual abolition of slavery never posited freedom as what come after slavery, posited servitude. What's Sophia's question?
Sophia's a great question. Maybe it will be
Sophia. I know Sophia.
I think she
I know Sophia, don't I, Sophia?
Unfortunately, she doesn't have a voice.
Okay, I'm just guessing that it's the Sophia I know.
I think it is, because I know that Sophia, I'm pretty sure it was Sophia who mentioned in the class this week that she'd taken some of your courses.
Oh, well, it must be that, Sophia.
Yeah, great.
What are you doing, man? Perhaps it's too practical a question, but how can teaching methods to divide change and such a change foster reconciliation?
For those of you who can't see the question, I should read it.
Oh, sorry, you read. I'm sorry, Nina.
No, I just realized that not everyone will be able to see it. So Sophia's asking, how can teaching methods syllabi change to foster the kind of reconceptualization and reimagining that Robbie was describing? And she says, I assume it isn't putting one different author or concept at the end of each week's reading list, which has sometimes been my experience in undergrad. And then how can students foster the kinds of changes that are necessary to do this reimagination?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of different things to that, but let me just give you two. One is to think about, scholars are like academics like to think of themselves as great conversationalists, right? And they like to think about the whole scholarly enterprise as one big long conversation, right? So you can take them at their word for that and say, we need to put these things in conversation, which is not to add. The conversation is not adding. When someone adds into the conversation changes, right? So in the same way, if you want to put Kant in conversation with Sylvia Winter, right, or Martin White in conversation with the nuclear free and independence group, that has to be a conversation which changes the registers and the coordinates of the discussion itself, right? Rather than a very kind of essentialized contrast. Imagine them in conversation. What would they say to each other, right? That way you take them more seriously. So I think that's one important thing to think about, and not to add on the the post-colonial or the race week at the end of week 12 or 13, right? But think about it as a real conversation from the very beginning, from the very, very beginning of the course. The second thing is to, and it's up to students, the tactics by which they take this to hand, but is to demand that what they are taught and how they are taught can actually make sense of the world which they inhabit now. And I'm not saying that to say that you can't do that with just Aristotle, actually, right? But what I'm saying is that it can't be a scholastic enterprise teaching, can't be a scholastic enterprise simply, right? These things have to make sense of the world and the seismic challenges which younger generations are having to face now, right? And that might include, might be trying to get different kind of people, authors included in, right? Get Black Lives Matter included into the syllabus for a political theory course, which is talking about freedom, or to get La Via Campesina incorporated into a course about environment, right, or about development. Yeah, but it cannot feel like it's simply a scholastic exercise. That can't be right.
Yeah,
I mean, it's got scholarship in it. That's why you're at university. There's a difference between that and being scholastic.
No, it really resonates. Also with some of the work that I've been trying to do in the class in IR theories. And for those of you who are taking the class, I invite you to try Robbie's challenge. Maybe find things that I haven't thought of. I'm very happy for you to bring in ideas and challenges. I know, fortunately, this week I did actually mention the nuclear free movement in New Zealand and had a little photo of it. although I didn't name any of the key leaders or thinkers behind that. So we've already had a little introduction, but I invite you. There's much more that we can do. I think unless there's any further questions, does anyone give a second? Or if Robbie, do you have anything final you wanted to add to the students or to what you've already presented today?
No, I just hope they're taking care of themselves, going for walks if they can, taking it one day at a time, not feeling like they have to pretend that it's not a pandemic that we're living through, not feeling that they have to be superhumans all the time.
It's really, yeah, good words. Elif Shafak, the Turkish writer, has written a great book. I've actually just got it here. For those of you students who want to stay sane in an age of division, I would recommend it.
Wow.
She talks about exactly those themes. Yeah, how we.
Oh, can you send me that reference?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
she talks about anger, apathy, and political voice anxiety, and also the need to hear voices that aren't heard, and her own life and her own stories, which is actually really interesting because she's a Turkish writer and has got some amazing reflections on Turkey, but also has been a traveler. So anyway, not trying to promote any other books. We've got one book that we're trying
to do it. I think you're a PDF man of mine. I don't care.
It's been such a pleasure to connect with you, Robbie, and I'm excited to continue the conversation and many other
for sure,
and to hear more about the work, obviously, with my interest in New Zealand, but also about these sorts of how do we spread these conversations in other spaces in academia and the classrooms that many of you are attending, and the conferences and the workshops, and so yeah, thank you so much for all the work.
Thanks, Nina. Hope to see you in Baltimore.
Yes, let's hope to engage at some point. And to all of you listening, thanks very much and have a really good evening.
Thank you.
Enjoy digesting that wonderful talk.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Grazie mille. Ciao.